Oh, it is my pleasure to introduce Jeff Pritchard, who will be talking to us tonight about the mysterious kingdom and coinage of Abyssinia.
The mysterious kingdom and coinage of Abyssinia. Actually, that should probably be kingdom since this is plural. But as I think most of you probably know, Abyssinia is what Europeans called Ethiopia really up until the 20th century. And Ethiopia, very strategically located, unfortunately, uh, that's is today because of the war. But in ancient times, it acted as a trading hub for water trade routes, kind of connecting the Mediterranean. So you've got the Greek Empire, you've got the Roman Empire connected through this area with India, Ceylon, even China, and of course, another entree um, into Africa. And what I'm going to be covering tonight is really, I find this Ethiopia very fascinating because it's got these sections, chunks, or vignettes of history that are really interesting and often overlooked by certainly most of us in the West. But what I'm going to cover is the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon and their relationship with Ethiopia, the Aksum Kingdom, which issued coinage in 250 to 650. Briefly about Amole, the salt money used in Ethiopia for probably about 3,000 years. Touch upon the Maria Theresa thalers. They actually were the coin of the realm in Ethiopia for over 100 years. And then Italy's quest for an African empire and how that turned out for Italy and Ethiopia. And then touch upon probably the most well known Ethiopian emperor of all, and that is Haile Selassie, and how he became kind of a Jamaican deity. So that's sort of a sidebar, but the numismatics tie in with all these areas. So the first aspect of this tonight kind of intertwines that the myth, legend, and history, and that's with the Queen of Sheba meeting with King Solomon. Uh, the actual first reference of Queen of Sheba is in the Old Testament. That's Kings 10, 1 through 13. And in the Old Testament, in fact, she's also mentioned in the Quran. In the Old Testament, it simply mentions that she is a monarch in a southern empire. And she hears about the wisdom and the wealth of King Solomon in Jerusalem. And so she and her entourage journey north to Jerusalem to meet King Solomon. She tests his wisdom. Is he as wise as everyone says? She brings an entourage of wealth with her, and then essentially returns to her kingdom in the south. Well, that legend kind of expanded over the years, where it eventually took on the story that Sheba and Solomon consummated their mutual admiration as mutual monarchs. And the Queen of Sheba returned to her kingdom, but she was pregnant and eventually bore the son sired by King Solomon. And that is estimated to be probably about 950 BC when that may have taken place. Well, historians view the Queen of Sheba of originating probably in the kingdom of Saba, which existed between about 1000 BC and 200. And this is in the southwest corner of what is now Yemen. Um, and the Empire of Saba, they were kind of viewed more as engineers than artisans. This is an example, one of the archaeological sites that still remains, the Great Dam of Marib. Marib was the capital of Saba. And this was done in about 8th century BC, created a huge man-made lake, provided the country with irrigation, very advanced irrigation and construction for the era. Well, Saba did have coinage, and they introduced that coinage in about 400 BC, so about 500 years after the legend of the Queen of Sheba. And the coinage they created, the purpose of it was to facilitate their international trade. They controlled the incense trade, so frankincense, myrrh, big deal back in those days. And their coinage, since it was to emulate or to facilitate international trade, it emulated Greek coinage. And so this is an example where you've got the helmeted Athena on the obverse, That N, or kind of lightning bolt on her cheek, if you will, was an indication of the value, in this case, a drachma. And then on the reverse, you've got the familiar Athenian owl. Again, this was issued by Saba, but it was to help their international trade. Uh, this is a gold coin from the era. You've got a male figure on the obverse and kind of a crude representation of that Athenian owl on the reverse again. Well, even today, from time to time, we see the Queen of Sheba featured on coinage. The example on the left is from Somalia, which is on the eastern side of Ethiopia. 100 shillings piece with the Queen of Sheba. And then the coin on the right is a commemorative piece issued by Israel in 2021, 2 shekels, portraying the Queen of Sheba meeting King Solomon. So you may be thinking, well, gosh, that's kind of interesting, but what about Ethiopia? And this gets back to the Queen of Sheba's son, that again, King Solomon supposedly sired. The son that she gave birth to was claimed by a lot of cultures and religions. But one of the most effective groups of sort of claiming him as their own were the Ethiopians. And he was named Menelik I. And he was considered by Ethiopians now to be the first ruler of both Saba and what would become Ethiopia. Those of you who are Indiana Jones fans would appreciate that one of the legends about Menelik I, the Queen of Sheba's son, is that as a young man, he journeyed back to Jerusalem and seized or stole the Ark of the Covenant, which supposedly held the 10 Commandments, returned south and crossed the Red Sea and hid it under a shrine in a city called Aksum. And that kind of leads us to the second Ethiopian part of the story, and that is the kingdom of Aksum. Aksum was really major empire from about 100 to 900. Again, the whole basis of its success, of its economy, was being an international trade route between, in this case, the Roman Empire, and again, India, Ceylon, China, and again, a gateway to Africa. At the real height of Aksum's power, they not only controlled this area in green, the green on the left, of course, encompasses much of Ethiopia, but a lot of the Arabian Peninsula, and as the slide indicates, they controlled a territory of about 1 million square miles, size of Alaska and Texas, so a large area. There was a prophet by the name of Mani in the 3rd century who wrote of the 4 great empires known in the world at this time. And he wrote of the Persian Empire, China, the Roman Empire, and Aksum. So in its day, Aksum was a pretty big deal, even though it's relatively unknown. So Aksum began issuing coinage in about 270 AD. Again, this was to facilitate international trade. And so their coinage, again, sort of like the coinage of Saba, their coinage had Greek lettering on it. This is a gold coin, and both the obverse and reverse features the king or the emperor. In this case, Emperor Endibus, who was the first emperor who issued any coinage. This was issued similar to the Roman tri-metal system, if you will, gold, silver, and bronze or copper. And you've got King Endibus on both the obverse and reverse. On the obverse, it says King Endibus, and the reverse, it says of Aksum. And those are supposed to be barley around him, which was at the time kind of a sign of abundance and whatnot. Well, the Aksum coinage is probably best known in historical or numismatic circles as being the first coinage that carried a Christian-inspired cross. In about 345 AD, the emperor of Ethiopia, King Ezana, converted to Christianity. And he changed his entire empire to become a Christian empire. And he placed the Christian cross on the top and bottom of his coinage. I can give you a little better picture of this. Before I do, I want to have to move my thing. One thing I thought was interesting, this again, this is a portrait of Izana on both obverse and reverse, wearing a different headpiece. But what he's holding down here on the reverse is a fly whisk, not something you see on coinage too frequently. But in this picture, you can see prior to King Izana changing to the cross, you've got the crescent, which represents the sun god, Shams, and that disc or that dot representing the lunar god or the moon god, Sin. And again, that was changed to the Christian cross. And Izana is also the one who first came up with the name of Ethiopia for the region. Well, the empire really achieved its height in about 550 AD. Something happened in 570 that began a long, slow, protracted decline of this empire. In 570, the Persians invaded and conquered Egypt, and they gradually worked their way down into the entire Arabian Peninsula. What they successfully did was they cut Aksum out of the international trade altogether. So they were no longer a trading hub. They weren't even a trading, participant. And of course, their entire economy was based on that. And I personally found interesting, and looking at a lot of this Aksum coinage, is that you can almost trace the decline of the empire in the quality of their coinage. This is a copper piece from between 550 and 600. They stopped issuing any coinage at all in about 650. They simply didn't need it. The empire was in such decline. But on this later piece, much cruder workmanship. The cross is still dominating, but the language now is no longer Greek. It's in Ge'ez, which is their native language, because they didn't need any international coins. It was just local. This is another example a little later, close to when they stop all minting of coinage. One of the interesting things here is that you can see that their coinage has been influenced by Byzantine coinage. Now, I wasn't aware of this. Many of you probably were, but on that Byzantine coinage, the portraits are always front-facing, head on, unlike almost any other coinage in the world, which is usually a sideways portrait. And my understanding is that the reason for this is that in Byzantine culture, if you could really trust someone, if they were trustworthy, you could look at them in both, in the eye, front on. If you were looking at them sort of sideways or askew or out of one eye, they weren't very trustworthy. Hence, that's why the Byzantine coinage supposedly is always front-facing portraits. But again, Aksum was influenced by that. Their last coinage was in about 650. And then it really trailed off to nothing. They actually abandoned their coastal city, moved inland, and by about 900, it was essentially gone. So I'm going to kind of switch gears here to a type of currency that was in use in Ethiopia during this period and long after. In fact, almost for 3,000 years. And that is amole, the salt money. Salt money was used, and it was named for the Amole tribe, which introduced it. Salt money, again, was used in Ethiopia since, thousands of years BC to actually as late as the 1930s in the real remote areas of Ethiopia. And the salt money, as you can see, it looks like a whetstone, but these were usually 10 to 18 inches long, maybe 1 to 3 inches deep. They typically weighed about a pound. And they were just blocks of rock salt. This is a picture from the British Museum. But they were just chunks of rock salt cut carefully. And they didn't use this salt for either the preservation or the preparation of food. That was a kind of a higher grade, a whiter salt. And these blocks usually turned gray or almost black because they were passed from hand to hand so much. But these were used, again, up until the early 20th century This is a picture from an Ethiopian market around 1910. And you can see the salt money there being exchanged. I guess that guy's the local bank. Um, but again, it was used for a very long time. Now, about the middle of the 18th century, Ethiopia did begin using a modern coin of exchange, and it became very, very popular, particularly along the coast, because by this time Ethiopia had obviously reestablished itself as a trading hub, and some of the bigger cities. But that wasn't Ethiopian coinage. It was actually the Maria Theresa thaler. Now, before I start this, I want to recognize Mark Benevenuto, a member of PCNS or a prior member of PCNS, who wrote a paper on the thalers, the Maria Theresa thalers, in 2012. In fact, he got second place in the contest. And I pulled some of the information about the actual coins themselves from that paper. So just wanted to recognize Mark's work. It was very good paper, and I plagiarized a bit of it. So Maria Theresa, born in 1717, she was the Empress of Austria, and they began issuing thalers with her likeness on them in the size that we're all familiar with in 1751. And they really became a popular trading coin, like, a trade dollar, so to speak. And this is that early version. And they were more and more popular. So every year they issued more and more. I think in 1751 they only issued 500,000. The next year was 1,000,000, and it kept increasing. Well, in 1765 her husband died, and so from 1765 on they portrayed her with a widow's veil, and this is the design we're also familiar with. And the reason we're so familiar with it is because in 1780 Maria Theresa herself passed away, and kind of to honor her, they continued issuing the thalers with the same portrait and the same date for several hundred years. You can go onto eBay and you can buy a 1780 Maria Theresa thaler for $30, and it's uncirculated. Um, Actually, more now because of the price of silver. But these are obviously modern restrikes. Um, so as far as the thaler itself, what's actually on the coin, and this is what I pulled from Mark's paper, which was again very good. So on the obverse around the periphery, you've got Latin abbreviations. And then on the slide, I put what the Latin actually represents, or what the Latin is for those abbreviations, and what it means in English. And on the obverse, it says Maria Theresa, by the grace of God, Empress of Hungary and Bohemia. And then on the reverse, we've got the Austrian-Hungarian coat of arms, the two-headed eagle representing the joining of those two countries. And around the periphery, it says Archduke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy, Count of Tyrol. Those are just a sampling. She had over a dozen titles to her name. And then the edge was also inscribed. It obviously didn't need to be abbreviated, but the edge lettering said justice and clemency, which were sort of the mottos, if you will, of her reign or her tenure. So, good question is, how in the world did these Maria Theresa thalers become so popular to where they were really the coin of the realm in Ethiopia, pretty long ways away from Austria? This is just actually an old postcard of the thalers being shipped to Harar, Ethiopia, back in 1910. But there's a number of reasons for that. The first being, of course, Ethiopia, since the Axum Empire, hadn't made any sovereign coinage, so they were going to have to use somebody else's coinage. The reason that it was the thaler was Ethiopia, which again had reestablished itself as a very important trading hub in the 18th and 19th century, always had a huge trade surplus. Ethiopia was exporting luxury goods to Europe and Arabia, or the Middle East, gold, ivory, frankincense, myrrh, exotic animals. And they're primarily importing textiles. So every year they had this huge trading surplus, which the Europeans paid for with these thalers. And so every year for well over a century, year after year after year, more and more and more of these thalers accumulated in Ethiopia. And it became to where in the major cities along the coast, that's essentially all that the merchants and whatnot would accept. This is a quotation I came across, and it's no way to know how accurate the numbers are, but it was written by a couple of historians who estimated that in 19 they wrote it in 35, but in 1931, 20% of the $245 million that had been minted during this time frame between 1780 and 31 were in Ethiopia. And again, there's no way to know how accurate that is, but I think it kind of testifies to how incredibly popular the thalers were in this part of the country. Another reason that the thalers were very aggregated in Ethiopia, and that is Ethiopia was involved in the slave trade. And the slaves didn't make their way to the Americas. The slaves went to the Middle East. And the slave traders at this time were the Arabs. And the Arabs paid cash for slaves, and they also preferred the thalers. And so this was another reason Ethiopia continued to aggregate thalers. The reason that the Arabian traders preferred the thalers, they also had a trade surplus with Europe, but in their case, it was for coffee that was exported to Europe. One of the kind of appalling things I discovered in doing this research is Ethiopia didn't outlaw slavery until the 1950s, not the 1850s, the 1950s, which was kind of crazy. So I'm going to pivot here. I think we've all heard the historical commentary about in certain situations needing the right person at the right time in the right place. For the U.S., maybe that was Abraham Lincoln. For Britain, maybe it was Winston Churchill. For Ethiopia, it was Emperor Menelik II, who ruled at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Menelik's given name was Salah Mariam. He was born in 1844, coronated as the King of Kings, Emperor of Ethiopia in 1889. Now, just like I guess the King of England or even the Pope, the Ethiopian rulers would choose their ruling name. And Salah chose Menelik II. Now, that was a pretty bold, maybe fortuitous, but a very bold move. There had not been a Menelik. Remember, Menelik I was supposedly the son of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. So, pretty bold move on Menelik's part to choose that name. Well, getting to the kind of touch upon the geopolitical situation now. This is a map from 1895 in the Horn of Africa. And at this point in time, colonialism in Africa is at its height. Africa has been carved up like a pizza by the European powers, obviously without the assent of Africa. But this is what the Horn of Africa looked like. And all the great powers, if you call them that, in Europe, had big chunks of Africa. France, Germany, England, Belgium. And for the European powers, of course, this was a great deal. Because not only was Africa a source of raw materials, potentially valuable raw materials, gold, diamonds, what have you, but it was a potential market for their manufactured goods. And at this time, having large international colonies was a mark of distinction for a country. Well, the one country in Europe that really didn't have much of a foothold in Africa was Italy. And they wanted more. They wanted a bigger piece of the pie. They had what they had was this area to the north of Ethiopia, Eritrea. They had some protectorates, sort of protectorates. Again, this is the area of Somalia, which is really cut up. But Italy wanted a bigger presence in Africa as a again um, kind of an international reputation thing. And one of the things they wanted to do was Italy was their national pride was um, insulted because Eritrea didn't use Italian coinage. They used the Maria Theresa thaler. And the reason little Eritrea used the thaler was because their two main trading partners, Ethiopia and Arabia, also used the thalers. Well, Italy was insulted by that, and they were going to solve that by introducing their own thaler. And they did so in 1891. Now, these are also called dollars, crowns. In Ethiopia, they were called beers. I'm going to, just for consistency's sake, kind of refer to all these as thalers. But Italy wanted to introduce an Eritrea thaler to essentially displace the Maria Theresa thaler and potentially provide some economic influence throughout that whole region. And so they created their own thaler. It was called the Calero Eritrea, and the largest was 5 lira, which you see here. And again, that was to compete with the Maria Theresa thaler. The obverse pictures King Umberto, and the reverse actually lists the value of this thaler in 3 languages: Italy, Amharic, which is Ethiopian, and then Arabian. Well, Italy made a couple mistakes with this. The first was just an assumption that they could easily displace the Maria Theresa thaler in Eritrea or Ethiopia when it had been the coin of the realm for over 100 years. But the real mistake was they put less silver in the Italian thaler than was in the Maria Theresa. And you can see over here that the Italian thaler only had 22.5 grams of silver. The Maria Theresa thaler had 23.4 essentially. So right off the bat, it's going to be kind of viewed as a second-class citizen. The other thing that Italy did, which ended up being a mistake, they thought it was very crude or primitive that the Maria Theresa thaler fluctuated with the price of silver. And so Italy pegged their thaler with their currency. They had a fixed rate of 5 lira to this thaler. And the problem for Italy was the price of silver was appreciating during this time. And so whereas the Maria Theresa thaler could benefit from that, because this Italian thaler was fixed to their currency, the lira, you could convert it, but it made it very cumbersome. It made it difficult in the marketplace. And as a result, it was kind of rejected or shunned by the general population. This turned out to be a real economic failure for Italy. In fact, in 1798, they demonetized it. They withdrew them from circulation. About 75% of what was issued in 91 and 96 were melted down. So it was a definite monetary failure. So turning to the relation between Italy and Ethiopia, because this plays into the financial or numismatic side. In 1889, those two countries entered what was called the Treaty of Uchiali. I had to practice pronouncing that. And this was done in 1889 during the first year that Menelik II was Emperor of Ethiopia. And this was a friendship treaty. And the reason Ethiopia entered into it was, here to the north, they've got Eritrea, a colony of Italy, and they understand that Italy's got, they've got colonial ambitions beyond Eritrea. So entering into a friendship agreement, made sense. But it turned out to be a real problem, a real miscommunication, if you want to be generous. The treaty was written in 2 languages, obviously, Italian and Amharic for the Ethiopians. The Italian version said that Ethiopia was required in all their international dealings to go through Italy, to go through their diplomatic channels, their bureaucracy. That, in a sense, made Ethiopia a protectorate of Italy. But the Amharic or Ethiopian version didn't say that. It said that if Ethiopia chose to, it could access those diplomatic channels in Italy, the bureaucracy and whatnot. And that was a huge point of contention. Italy said, no, you are now a protectorate of us. You've signed this agreement. And of course, Ethiopia disagreed. And Menelik spent the next 4 to 5 years basically trying to reach out to the King Umberto of Italy, and he was essentially ignored, or other European powers. And the European powers, of course, sided with Italy, trying to get this resolved diplomatically. Now, one of the things that Menelik did as part of this diplomatic effort was issuing sovereign coinage. There had not been sovereign coinage in Ethiopia since the Aksum Empire. And I went over this particular coin and subsequent version in a presentation I did on Jules Chaplin, so I'll cover this pretty quickly. But these were issued at the Paris Mint. This particular one was designed by Legrand. You have Menelik II on the obverse, and on the reverse, you have the Lion of Judah carrying the Christian staff over its left shoulder. And they only issued 20,000 of these, so really small issuance of these coins. They have crowns, I think they were referred to, because it was really done for political purposes, not as a big economic means. One of the things that Ethiopia did, they didn't make the mistake Italy did, is they made sure that these had the exact same amount, actually a tiny bit more, as the Maria Theresa thalers. Because if they were going to be interchangeable or potentially eventually displace the Maria Theresa thalers, they can't have less silver. And so that was one good thing they did. These were issued in 1894, and again, they only made 20,000 of them because at the time, Ethiopia was doing something else with its silver. Well, after all this back and forth, Italy finally lost its patience, and in late 1895, they decided they were going to enforce this treaty. They were going to invade Ethiopia, conquer Ethiopia, and make it either a protectorate or probably a colony. And this is a point where Maria Theresa thalers not only were an economic factor within Ethiopia, the Maria Theresa thalers actually helped change the course of Ethiopian history and really influence all of African history. Now, remember how I was talking about how, they were aggregating, they were all throughout the country. It was the coin of the realm. And what that did was that gave the government of Ethiopia kind of a modern way to tax their citizens. Previously, if they wanted to tax their citizens prior to the thalers, what they got in return was only salt money, wheat, cattle, horses, not great stores of value, certainly not something that's very effective on the international buying and selling of goods. When those thalers were throughout the country, the government could tax their citizens and get thalers in return, and get and could buy modern equipment, and that included modern weaponry. The Italians invaded Ethiopia, the northern Ethiopia, in early 1896 with 17,000 troops. They all kind of came together in a small town called Adwa. Italy was unaware of the fact that Menelik had been very successful in recruiting other kind of sub-kingdoms or tribal groups to add to his army to repel this Italian invasion. By early 1896, Menelik had amassed an army of estimated between 75 and 100,000 soldiers. Now, in reality, being outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1, probably normally wouldn't have mattered. Colonial armies were always outnumbered, but they had such an advantage, such a superiority in weaponry that the numbers didn't matter. In the early 19th century, the Italians had machine guns, and if they were facing an army armed with spears, again, the numbers weren't going to matter. But what the Italians didn't realize is that both Menelik II and his predecessor had used those tax receipt thalers to buy modern European equipment, including weaponry, primarily from France and Russia. By the time the Italians crossed into the Ethiopian border, Menelik had stockpiled estimated 100,000 modern rifles. So the Italians were not facing a primitive mass of natives with bows and arrows. They were facing a modern army. The politicians got involved and forced the Italian generals to invade or attack sooner than they wanted into unfamiliar mountainous terrain. The Italian forces got separated. As you can imagine, it was a disaster. The Italian forces were almost annihilated. 50% were either killed, wounded, or captured. This was a huge international humiliation for Italy. They were soundly defeated. Conversely, it elevated dramatically the stature of both Menelik II and Ethiopia. I mean, this was news in all the world press that this modern European army had been soundly defeated, routed by this army of natives. As part of that, Italy paid Ethiopia 10 million lira in 1898 as reparations. Now, in reality, that 10 million lira was to get most of their prisoners of war back. But one of the things that influx of funding provided was the silver, which Ethiopia could now manufacture coins or have the Paris Mint manufacture coins at a quantity that could actually have an impact on the economy and on commerce. This is the second version of these thalers done at the Paris Mint, and these are the ones revised by Jules Chaplin, where you've got Menelik II on the obverse and that Lion of Judah on the reverse. And the one difference being that Christian staff is now over the lion's right shoulder. And as I relayed 6 months ago, in Ethiopian Christian culture, the right side is prominent, whereas in European Christian culture, the left side is prominent. And that is how portrayed in the art of how the Virgin Mary, which side she holds the Christ child on. And so that change was made, but they were now able to issue more and more coinage. They gradually were able to push out those Maria Theresa thalers and even the Amoli salt money over time. I threw this in very quickly. This is a map of Africa, right before World War I. And literally every single inch of Africa has been cut up, divided, claimed by European powers, except Ethiopia. Now, there is one other country over on the Western Africa, small Liberia, which fascinating history in its own right, since it was founded by freed American slaves back in the 1850s. But Ethiopia is the only independent country of any significance. They are the only country that successfully repelled a colonial invasion. So I'm going to switch to, again, the most well-known, this is almost a sidebar, but we have a numismatic tie-in. The best known Ethiopian emperor of all, and that is Haile Selassie. And Haile Selassie was born in 1892. He was the second cousin, I believe, of Menelik, Menelik II. And Selassie's given name was Tafari Makonnen. And he was coronated in late 1930. And the ruling name he chose was Haile Selassie, which translated from Amharic means power of the Trinity. And he was viewed in the country as the 225th successor to that Solomonic and Sheba dynasty. So the 225th generation of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. So as you would expect, they featured him on coinage. This is a coin from 1931, which features Haile Selassie on the obverse. You've got the Lion of Judah, again on the reverse with the Christian staff. And now the language that's being featured is in both Amharic, the Ethiopian language, and also Ge'ez, which is kind of interesting, which is that language from uh, the kingdom of Saba, um, you know, 2,000 years ago. So, in addition to coinage, Ethiopia eventually established a national bank, federal bank. That was in 1905. It was actually called the Bank of Abyssinia because it was funded by Europeans who were still calling them Abyssinia. You can see, though, the denomination is thalers. Again, still kind of displacing those Maria Theresa thalers. This was issued in 1933. The first paper currency was 1915. But they did in time gradually push out the Maria Theresa thalers and even that salt money, which again was up until this time still being used in the remotest areas of Ethiopia. Turning to why Haile Selassie became so famous, there was a kind of a prophet, if you will, by the name of Marcus Garvey. Uh, he was a Jamaican-born Black or African activist who had a very large following of his own. But in 1920, he had a prophecy of looking to Africa when a Black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is at hand. And many, many in the Caribbean and primarily Jamaica viewed Haile Selassie as that person. If you look at his given name, his title was Ras, but his name Tafari Makonnen, that title and the first name became Ras Tafari. Haile Selassie was the genesis of the Rastafarian movement. The Rastafarians believe that God had appeared in human form on earth 3 times. One appears in the Old Testament, a priest by the name of Melchizedek. I'm probably not pronouncing that very well. The second time, Jesus. The third time, Haile Selassie. And Selassie did visit Jamaica in 1966, and huge deal, as you can imagine. Over 100,000 appeared just at the airport to greet him. And the story is that his plane is coming in and it's pouring down rain. And it turns around and begins to land, and the rain stops. And the plane taxis, and it comes to a stop. And as the door opens and Selassie steps forth, the clouds part and a ray of sunshine shines onto Haile Selassie. Don't know how accurate that is, but obviously he's featured on coinage throughout his tenure. By 1972, he's 80 years old, and Selassie's kind of his administration really got weaker and weaker as he aged. And apparently there were 2 major droughts in northern Ethiopia during his reign. And apparently it's said that the government totally mishandled how those famines were treated, resulting famines. And as a result, several 100,000 people died that many feel shouldn't have. And as a result, there was a lot of upheaval. There was a communist coup in 1974, which was successfully took over the country, and Selassie was displaced. That communist coinage during their era, this is coinage from 1977, very reminiscent of Soviet coinage during this era. You've got they've retained the lion, which is a bit of a surprise because of the symbolism. But the reverse of all their coinage pictures these triumphant, happy workers celebrating the joy of working in a communist system with their tools raised over their head. Again, I visited Russia in '79, and this kind of stuff was all over the place on posters and coinage and whatnot. But that concludes my Ethiopian 3,000 years of history in one evening. I find it fascinating because they've got some really interesting segments within their history that are important from a coinage standpoint, but certainly often overlooked by Western civilization, if you will. So with that, I will stop screen sharing and turn it back over to you, Jason.